Hello and welcome to the Emotional Work podcast, where we take a deep dive into the human condition. And I am incredibly excited today because I first had the thought of doing this podcast back in November or December, I think it was. It might have been earlier than that, back in 2017. And it's just taken us a while to get together to do the recording for today. So I am incredibly excited about what we're going to get into today and the topics we're going to explore. So today is about emotion at work in humanising work, if I can say the word work again in that many times in one sentence, and it comes from, I think it started from a tweet or a comment on LinkedIn around bureaucratisation or bureaucratising things, and then that prompted a discussion between myself and our guest today, which we then had a Skype, and then I got really excited on the Skype call that we had. I was like, we need to do a podcast on this, it'd be amazing, and then we finally got round to organising it and pulling it together for today. So without further ado, let's get our guest on the air and let's welcome along Sarah Taylor. Hi Sarah.
Hi Phil.
How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Now that we've got past our slight technological hitch this morning.
Yeah, we got there in the end though, didn't we? We had multiple ways and means of recording, so we got there in the end.
Indeed.
So what I'd like to do then is to start, as I start all of my podcasts then, with an unexpected but innocuous question. So it's a different way, I guess, of getting to know our guest without asking you to tell us, to do the classic kind of what do you do and where do you come from type thing. So let's start with so my innocuous yet unexpected question today is, what lines have been crossed either with you or for you recently?
Ooh, wow, okay. What lines have been crossed recently? That's one I might need to think about. As all the best questions usually do, lead you to have to think a little bit. Hey.
So one for me is I have like this thing. I don't know if it's a value, but like when I hear people talk, or when I see people having discussions on social media, I have a thing about, like, I want contributions to be helpful, or I can see some kind of helpful intent behind what it is. So if there's a contribution to a discussion, or somebody's passing comment on something, that I work really hard to see, like, how is that helping? What's the helpful intent that sits behind that comment or question? And there was one recently that just got me really cross, because I reckon it must have been at least 20 minutes, if not half an hour, trying to come up with a way that it was helpful, and it just wasn't. And it was somebody that I know fairly well, and it surprised me, because it's not something that kind of I would normally expect to see in that way. Normally, so when I see or hear their contributions, I think, I can see where that's coming from. But this one, I just didn't get it, and it really annoyed me, because I was like, it just got me to thinking, I don't see how that's helpful. I don't see how that is in any way kind of helpful or contributing to. Either contributing to the discussion or contributing to, kind of furthering the debate, or being, I really struggled to find some helpful intent behind it. And then I went into all this analysis work then around, why has that made me so angry? Why has that made me really cross? But I think that what that kind of got me to the point of, I have a line which is that I need to be able to see, or I want to see some helpful intent behind something. And when I don't, that makes me go,
Yeah, absolutely. That is kind of triggering quite a lot for me, actually, in terms of just how we have debates at the moment, whether it's in person or using social media, as you say. And it does remind me of a line as an audience member, actually. I went along to a really fascinating talk and book signing by somebody called Rupert Sheldrake.
Okay.
Come across, yeah.
No.
So, he writes some really quite interesting things around science and spirituality, and how, in his mind, the two need not and are not separate and contradictory. And he's had a fascinating kind of life and work that's led up to that, and written lots of books. So if you wanted to look into that, I would suggest Googling. But I went along to this talk thinking, gosh, that'd be really interesting. He's written this new book about spiritual practices for daily life, something like that. I've got the title wrong, but that was the kind of gist of it. And he talks about things like gratitude modern day pilgrimages, really kind of interested things. And what was really, really fascinating was not, well, the talk itself was fascinating, but more so was the audience participation afterwards.
Okay.
Some really, really kind of insightful, thoughtful, genuinely kind of seemed curious questions about all sorts, really, you know, and he was able to really brilliantly respond to all of these, but with such humility. That was the thing that really inspired me and stood out, that this guy clearly knows so much about such a vast range of topics, and yet was often prepared to say, do you know, that is something that is at the limits of human understanding, and we cannot be too flippant or too certain when we talk about these things. You know, someone had asked him about quantum mechanics, something like that, and that was his view. But the thing that relates to what you were saying, and I suppose the line that was crossed for me, was an audience member who quite dogmatically asserted that what he'd heard was a load of nonsense. And because something of interest to him hadn't been cited as being part of these practices, you know, it was all a load of nonsense. And, you know, how come we hadn't looked at it from this angle? And the guy responded with humility again and said, well, you know, there are different frameworks for coming at these things, to which the audience member replied, no, this is the framework, the only framework. And it was just quite fascinating, because previously the discussion had been about dogmatism and, you know, what is this need for humans to feel this sense of certainty and to feel right. And yeah, how we're not so great at doubt and sitting with uncertainty. So it's quite amusing in some ways, that then we got this very, very dogmatic question that followed. So yeah, totally. So I guess a line was kind of crossed there, even though it wasn't directed at me. Yeah. You know, I felt uncomfortable listening to it, and it was such a shame, really. But it, you know, it didn't seem to faze the speaker at all, and then he responded really quite kindly, I thought, considering. So, but yeah, you do see a lot of that, it seems now. People really want to get their points across at all costs, and the intention seems to be right, you know, to kind of win something rather than be curious, expand people's thinking. So yeah, that's definitely a trigger.
And I guess so. I'm going to use that then as a segue into where we're going. So that want to be of certainty and to be right, and you know, to know what's happening and either what's happening now, or to know that our understanding of the world is accurate and that sort of thing. I guess in terms of some of your research and some of your studies, then the period of the period that work is in now, in that that shift from, if we go with that shift around being from a kind of a more mechanistic industrial age or way of working to a more kind of humanistic way of working, I guess that would then by definition bring with it those elements of uncertainty and lack of clarity and having to question and doubt our experiences, our practices, and what we've done.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so a big theme of what I was looking at was this idea of paradigm change or shifting worldviews, and as you say, kind of moving away from being heavily invested in this mechanistic industrial worldview to something else. And there seems to be a yearning for more human ways of working. And yet we can't be too, I don't think we can be too prescriptive or too certain about what is emerging, you know, what is next for our fundamental ideas about what it means to be human, what it means to work in human ways. Human nature is constantly evolving, and I think, you know, it might be useful to theorize and wonder about what's next. Thinking about utopias potentially, different ways of working, but yeah, there has to be some kind of humility and doubt, and for me it's about a spirit of inquiry rather than trying to lock these things down or get into arguments about definitive ideas of the future, really. Yeah, if we're kind of on the edge of something, then it's a little bit like it's not a straight line into the future, it's this curved line, and you can't see around the curve. So and there is a model called Theory U based on that very idea that the future is emerging, and you can't just predict it and work backwards from this known future state, because it is uncertain and it's kind of around the corner rather than straight in front of you. So yeah, how do you work wisely with that, I guess, is a good question.
Oh, see, now you give me a lead in and I really want to ask that. I want to play that question back to you, but before I do that, I guess I want to start on a bit more of a personal note, if that's all right. So,
yeah, sure.
So how did you kind of what took you or pulled you or pushed you or dragged you or whatever movement based metaphor I'm going to use? How did you find this stuff then? Where did it all start for you?
So I suppose part of it started back when I was an undergraduate. I studied philosophy, and I was always really interested and grew more interested throughout that time in how our ideas about being human, what it means to be a human, actually shape our realities, shape how we organise our workplaces, how we organise society. And I still do get quite frustrated. Here's another line, actually, that can be crossed with me. When people think, philosophy or some of the social sciences, it's just hot air or it's just theorising, but it's not connected to reality. Okay. And I kind of think, well, it really fundamentally shapes our reality. We talk about root causes of things. I guess I was always interested in root ideas, if you like. So how do our beliefs ultimately shape how we do things? So that was kind of this interest that I had, combined with always being really, I suppose the context of that for me was always healthcare, health and well-being, but health in the wider sense. What does it mean to live a good life, to thrive, not just to be absent of disease, and became quite interested in our current times, the kind of things that we seem to be afflicted by, and as well as, of course, we've still got infections, we've still got diseases that require treatment, but we've got these so-called diseases, if you like, as well. So what's that all about? So I suppose that was my kind of question that motivated me to pursue that line of study, and then ultimately work-wise to get involved with the NHS and then with a local authority health and social care department. And at that time, feeling a little bit myself, often frustrated, feeling a little bit disenchanted with how we do things, feeling a little bit sometimes like a cog in a machine. And, I was working for, I've been lucky enough to have fantastic managers, wonderful teams, been involved with some really exciting projects. And yet I just felt there was something about working in a large bureaucratic organisation that could sometimes have this deadening effect, this stifling effect. Just that thing of bureaucracy, really. So I was kind of having that frustration combined with these interests in, well, I wonder why, I wonder why we have got ourselves into a place where we organise ourselves this way. And I'd often had a wondering about doing further studies. I am quite a geek. I love reading, love learning. So I had often wondered, would I go back to academia? Would I do a PhD? And I always remember actually being given some advice by one of my lecturers back when I was an undergrad. And she always said, if you're thinking about doing a PhD, do it because it would be an end in itself. So even if it didn't change anything really in your life or your career, do it because it's a topic that, you would just love to explore in depth for that length of time, and it would be worth doing regardless. So I always had that in my mind, and never really saw a place that my interests would neatly fit within a kind of school or a discipline. Yeah. And then I came across this, I can't remember how I came across it now, but this work called The Fifth Wave of Public Health. And what this did was it kind of charted developments in public health, so the way we organised our health systems, and thought about health since the Enlightenment to basically now. And they thought of these ideas of waves as kind of like a metaphor for paradigms, ways of thinking. And they were really interested in root ideas as well, and kind of how our ideas about human nature what it means to live a good life, what's important, actually gave rise to these different ways of organising healthcare. And what they said was, we've had kind of 4 waves up until now, and, you know, they've all been different, they've all had their unique features, but they've all been kind of this part of this modernist overall wave. And what they asked was, what is next for the health of society? What would a 5th wave in public health look like? And they also recognised feeling that the 4th waves were quite mechanistic, had an external fix it. Oh, we've been cut off. Hello.
Hello. I don't know what happened there.
Oh no, that's okay. It might have even been me. I'm not sure.
So I had you up to what's the 5th wave?
Okay. So what's the 5th wave? So basically they're asking about what's next, and they recognise that the previous 4 waves had at their heart a kind of external fix-it approach. That systems would fix things for us. Mechanistic, bureaucratic, and so what's next? And they wondered about, you know, what a more human, relationship-focused 5th wave would look like that addressed these dis-eases, as they called them, of modernity. And they kind of saw, you know, that there's been some brilliant things, you know, anaesthetic dentistry. My supervisor would often talk about, you know, who would want to give that up? Nobody. You know, not knocking these brilliant advances that this kind of worldview gave rise to. But what they're kind of saying is, for the challenges that we're facing now, you know, aging population, loneliness, obesity, addictions, actually there's a different mindset that's going to be helpful here. So we're experiencing diminishing returns of this previous worldview, and potentially also adverse effects. So actually giving rise to some of these challenges that we see. So I became fascinated by that and thought, brilliant. Discovered that one of the lead authors was in fact an academic at Glasgow University. Approached him with a very kind of broad idea for a PhD, and we got chatting, and I was fortunate enough, because he was going to be retiring, that I became his last ever doctoral student that he supervised.
Wow.
And yeah, I just had this sense of, brilliant, this is somewhere that I can fit, you know. So that's really what led up to doing the PhD.
Wow, it's an amazing story.
It's a long story, sorry about that.
No, not at all. But there's lots of different aspects that within it. So just to sort of, I guess, check my understanding on something for a moment. So sorry, I'm distracted. Somebody's trying to FaceTime me. That was weird. Sorry. So you talked about the large bureaucratic bit and you being frustrated by that, plus your curiosity on these not root causes, you call them root ideas, is that right?
Root ideas, yeah.
So is that, so the what popped into my head, and I want to check that my understanding is accurate, is that there's a is it fair to say, I'm going to say it now anyway, so there's a narrative that we have an ageing population, and that ageing population are a burden on society because they are draining resources, they are draining time, they are draining money. Those physical and non-physical resources are being drained by that elderly ageing population who are living longer, which is causing society issues. And so what that then does is that influences public perception, it influences public decision making, it influences government policy, that sort of thing. So is that an example? And I'm happy for you to say no, you're wrong, Phil, because I am often wrong. But is that an example of a root idea and how it then shapes what happens as a result?
Yeah, no, I would say you're right there. I think that narrative that we've got around the burden, if you like, of an ageing population, the idea that we even see it as a problem in society, absolutely kind of shapes our ideas. I guess what I would probably go even further than that and have really in the thesis of saying, okay, so what's given rise to the idea of ageing being a problem. And there's a couple of root ideas that I found give rise to that. So my PhD was a little bit like being a detective at times, which made it quite interesting, because you ask questions like that, you chat to people and you see where it goes. So some of the things really are quite fundamental. So you go back to what our beliefs in kind of Western Enlightenment thought, if you like, are around what it means to be human. And, you know, to put it in a crude, simplistic way, there's this idea of being a human as this rational, independent actor, if you like. So, of course, aging becomes problematic when aging is associated with losing some of those rational cognitive functions, with losing some of this independence, you know. And then that's not to make a judgment about all aging, or that, you know, that happens to everybody, but brilliant book by Atul Gawande, What Matters in the End, I think it's called. You know, he kind of talks about if independence is what we live for, you know, how do we make sense of a meaningful life when, for many of us, losing independence will be a reality in the latter years of life. And then you've got this kind of thing around the history of care for older people. So briefly, there's ideas that come from that have shaped, again, the idea of older people being a burden. So you look at when sort of care homes came about on the back of when there was different ways to access care. You had what are now the teaching hospitals, these brilliant medical specialisms that were attracting so much and rightly so, kind of attention around wonderful medical cures and treatment. And there was something around the fact that for older people and for people with disabilities, that for whom a treatment approach just doesn't apply, they didn't attract the same funding, the same attention, the same kind of kudos, I suppose, as a medical specialty. So became seen as something second rate. And even in the Beveridge report, quite fascinating, it warns against being lavish to old age and unproductive members of society. So even right back then, you've got this kind of belief there about, you know, older people not being productive because you can't cure them, you know, really so all these kind of things. And so what happened when geriatrics emerged as a specialty,
as a discipline,
as a discipline, exactly, they almost had to kind of prove themselves within this prevailing discourse that was all around fixing things, treating things, and to fit within this dominant discourse rather than compete with it. They presented themselves as, you know, well, we can free up hospital beds by, okay, not curing these things, but by restoring some kind of functionality, some sort of independence to people, so they can be discharged, free up beds that are needed in these medical facilities. So you've kind of from the very beginning got people that are not trying to, well, I suppose they're trying to solve the wrong problem. The problem was, how do we free up these hospital beds? So from way back, you've got these inherited ideas about what it is to age, what it means to care for an older person. And I guess when you think about industrialization, you know, all the things that we know about, standardization of tasks, economies of scale, all these kind of ideas, caring can become seen as an action to be performed. And you look at the language of caring, you know, products of care, packages of care, very much fitting with this narrative of industrialized ways of doing things. So, yeah, you inherit a way of thinking about care as something to do rather than a way of being. So those are some examples of the kind of root ideas that I was exploring.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I guess you've got elements of linguistics and language then within that. So you gave some examples of the packages of care, the processes of care, rather than care being a way of being. So I'd like to pick up on that last one a little bit more. So tell me a bit more your thoughts on that then. So about care as a way of being.
Yeah, so care as a way of being, I think, for its root idea, it depends on an idea of the self as being something that's relational. So there's people that talk about relational care. Martin Buber, he talks about rather than having an I-it relationship, he talks about an I-thou relationship. And the I-it relationship, that's kind of characterized by, I'm an I, so I've got my subjectivity, but you're an it. So there's some detachment there, some objectivity. The I-thou relationship is much more this kind of genuine connection of two subjects meeting. And you really respond to the specific uniqueness of that individual and that relationship. And crucially, you're both changed by that encounter. It's not like one of you's this static self. And so if you have those ideas about what it means to be human, it's quite natural that caring contains, it's a way of being, as well as an action. Don't get me wrong, we're not saying this is good versus bad here, but just that maybe the caring as a way of being has been neglected in this worldview. So caring as a way of being is much more about those internal states, so being really present with somebody, being empathetic, being attuned to their states, and being in a reciprocal relationship. So it's not that this older person is just a passive recipient that you just kind of care for. You're together there in a relationship and both changed by it. So you can't kind of just see it as an action that isn't affected by emotional inner states.
And I guess the term caregiver, presupposes that I-it kind of relationship rather than I-thou, would you say?
Yeah, totally, yeah.
So what did your and I know this is a really big question, so it might be that we need to come back to it and review it a couple of times. So I think what we've been trying to do is to set a philosophical / theoretical backdrop to the discussion and your findings in your research so far. So thinking about it from we've got this this shift in the world where we're moving from one which is standardized and rationalized and consistent and stable to one actually which is much more in flux, and like you said, we can see the corner but not what's coming around it. And so how does that link into what you found in your research then?
Okie doke. So I guess a big part of the research focus was very practical. So I know we've spoken a lot about the theory and the philosophy, if you like, but it was a case study. So it was a case study of care homes for older people. And I guess what I was really interested in is, okay, so let's say that we are experiencing this shift, or we're on the edge of some great shift. Well, okay, that's fine, and we could spend time, focusing on a critique of the previous way of doing things, or we could focus on the future and what's emerging. But actually, what I was quite interested in was, well, what is it like to be on the edge of a great shift? What's happening right now for people in this messy time of transition, where the old worldview will be still exerting a very dominant influence in the way that we do things, the way we think about things. But equally, we might experience signs or seeds of the new in what we're doing, lots of new ideas, yearning, if you like, striving for different ways of doing things, experiments. So what is it like for people right now that are on the edge of all this and experiencing these kind of messy times of the old diminishing and the new arising? So, and because of my interest in care, and because of my role at the time was involved with a kind of quality improvement program in care for older people in a local authority, and I'll just say a local authority because it's not named in the thesis as part of the confidentiality. So it was really kind of getting to know, well, what are the experiences of frontline care workers and also domestic staff that worked in these care homes? Because as it turned out, they've got just as much a huge part to play in the life of the care home. And also for care home managers and senior managers that, there's a great phrase, can't remember who says it now. I think it's the International Futures Forum, that what we're trying to do at the moment in life, in some ways, is redesign the plane whilst keeping it in the air, you know? So we're still trying to do what we've got to do whilst doing these transformational things. So what's that like for care workers, for managers and senior managers? So, and I was exploring their experiences in light of these root ideas, if you like, and also some perspectives from people that do theorize about what might be emerging. So there's been there was lots of talk at the time around this term co-production in care, and how can we have more co-productive care homes. And co-production is all about reciprocal relationships, doing with rather than to, and really looking at the assets of individuals rather than their deficits and problems, and bringing those to bear. So I kind of thought, well, okay, that sounds great. That sounds actually really, really kind of in keeping with what might be emerging. But let's just see how all that's playing out. How is this being interpreted and understood and enacted on the ground by people working in care? And maybe what are some of the blind spots, tensions and contradictions in this messy time that are either, you know, making it more or less easy, I suppose, for the potential of co-production to be reality, or for it to become a little bit subsumed in the old ways of doing things.
And when you say people, just to make it clear, so you're talking about the people that work in these establishments, as opposed to the residents or their families or so on. So the focus of your research was from like an employee or a carer perspective, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you know, and that's probably one of the main limitations of the research. But it was always at the outset, I'd kind of discovered this gap for the workforce perspective, that there wasn't really much known about how particularly frontline care workers were experiencing this shift and what it meant to them. So to ground the research and give it a little bit more focus, that was the sort of boundaries put around it, that this would be about the workforce experience rather than the residents or the relatives' experience.
Yeah, and that's I'm okay with that. I just wanted to make sure that I was understanding it correctly.
Yeah, I think I was stepping slightly into thinking, gosh, that was a question in my Viva defence. I have reasons for that choice.
and I think you're right. You know, so I've got a friend of mine who works in a care home, and she describes to me a daily struggle that she has between achieving the tasks that she's being asked to do and providing the care that she wants to provide. Yeah, so her role is, I would argue, quite fundamental. She frames it as junior, but they're quite different views. But anyway, so her role is one of kind of cleaning and tidying and changing bedding and that sort of things. And yeah, she talks to me about how sometimes when she goes in to clean a resident's bathroom or to change their bed, that what the resident wants is they just want to chat. They just want to have somebody be with them for that period of time. And for some, she'll be able to do that while she's completing the task that she's being asked to do. For some, she'll stop what she's doing and have the discussion or be, for want of a better phrase, be present with the person whose room she's working in. But she says that kind of goes at odds with the expectations or the standards that are set for what her role is, because what her role is measured on is how much cleaning she gets done, not how many residents she chats to and provides some relief and respite to their day, if that makes sense. And she says she struggles with that.
Yeah, that really, really resonates with some of the main findings, actually, that, people either go into this job because they've got a real sense of vocation, actually, or they've gone into it maybe not knowing exactly what they wanted to do. Some people go into care work straight from school, but discover this real love of just making a difference to someone's day. That's how participants described it. And so they've gone into it, or they've experienced real pride and joy in their work, based on the relational elements, these conversations, the connection. And you're right, just like your friend there, lots of care workers felt this incongruence between what they were wanting to do, and sometimes at a high level what they were being asked to do at a policy level, let's say, work in a person-centred, relationship-centred way.
Yeah, okay.
But ultimately, on a day-to-day basis, care workers said, and they use this expression, it's like we're timed. You've got these really rigid set routines, tasks to do, and as you say, if that's what's getting measured, the relational can be really missed. And interestingly, some care workers even felt guilty for spending time talking to residents. They'd say, oh gosh, I feel like I'm having a skive by sitting and having a chat for longer with a resident, when actually, that's amazing. That's a wonderful thing that they're doing, and yet they're holding this sense of guilt for doing some of these amazing things and having these conversations. So yeah, absolutely, that really, really resonates.
So what are some of the things that shape that then? Either from see, now I'm doing I always criticize hosts for asking like 5 questions at once, and I've already done it once in this podcast where I asked you 5 different questions than you answered the last one on it. But so I'm kind of kicking myself, going, no, stop asking lots of questions at the same time. What did your research find, or what, if anything, did your research find about the reasons for that? For that discord between, or that disconnect between what a policy might say and then what is actually happening kind of day to day?
Yeah, so I suppose one of the things that for me was really, really interesting and perhaps not surprising is that there was no big bad guys. I couldn't find any anyway of these people that are these lovers and custodians of bureaucratic systems. Nobody wanted, or nobody intentionally set out. You
can't say that because then that ruins that ruins another narrative that we have. Like there's these pen pushers somewhere that wear thin rimmed glasses and have thin lips and suits and sit behind a desk looking at spreadsheets.
Absolutely. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's a slight tangent, but sadly, to my shame, I do regularly watch EastEnders. And you notice on EastEnders, if there's ever a manager that comes in for a few episodes, they totally fulfil that kind of stereotypical of the pen pusher. But anyway, tangent there. But yeah, so I've lost.
Sorry, I interrupted you. Sorry, you were talking about how you didn't find the bad guys.
Oh yeah. So nobody, whether it was the inspectors or the senior managers, everybody was kind of saying that they wanted the same thing. That they understood that what mattered to people was the human stuff, the relationships and the connections, and yet, we're all part of this deeply complex, entangled, inherited system and ways of doing things that got in the way. So I suppose that's the kind of first thing, that it certainly wasn't because of these big bad guys there. But yeah, things, and again, it comes back to the root ideas in some ways, that because we've got this idea of caring as an action or a task, and that's also the stuff that's easier to measure and to record.
Indeed.
That's playing a part. You've also got this really, really heavily scrutinised workforce as well, with lots of, we all remember the horror stories, the cases that make the media, and care workers did speak about that and how that impacted upon their working days. So you've got these rules, these professional standards that even the senior managers were kind of saying, God, have you read them? If you read them and if you followed them to the letter, to use their words, you would be robotic with residents.
Really?
Because that's literally what somebody said. So there was an awareness that these things, because we try and lock it all down in rules and things that can be written and prescribed, there's a danger, isn't there? And I think, let's not take away from the fact of the underfunding in older people's care as well. Yep. So time and resources came up again as something that was making it really, really difficult for care workers to be in the moment and be present with that resident, because, they were relying on agency workers and they were covering this shift. They were running from task to task. So you've got these kind of very real things. But what was interesting was it wasn't just the lack of time that made it difficult to focus on the relational. It was the cognitive space that changed. So if you're going from task to task to task, you're thinking about what you've got to get done next. Are you simply able to, when you do have some time, kind of snap into this much more present, much more slower way of being? I mean, I know myself that I find that hard. That's why I said for this podcast, can we do it first thing in the morning before I get into the kind of emails and tasks of my day? Because it just puts me in a different mindset. So, there's something about all these things, how they kind of combine, to make it more difficult, really, for people to have these really relational moments with residents, and yet they did have them, which was, it's remarkable, the kind of stories that you hear, but it did feel very much in spite of a very bureaucratic system, rather than obviously because of, in some ways.
Well, I guess it's it's in what I'm finding interesting in that is the recognition, or the awareness and or the recognition that the standards have been put together to protect. I guess, are they there to protect? Is that their dominant function? So
yes, I think for good intentions, to keep people safe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, you've got awareness and or recognition from within the sector that actually to follow all of these things to the letter would mean that we would be robotic with residents. And yet my perception anyway, as somebody who's outside of that sector, is that there's nothing being done to change those standards or to shift them or amend them. But I want to sense check that with somebody who knows the sector a lot better than I. So is there work being done to try and shift or to change that almost conflicting aspect of it?
Yes, I think there is work being done, more so in pockets, I would say. And the work that I found the most inspiring in this regard is by a friend and somebody who was hugely inspirational for this PhD, Nick Andrews, who's done a lot of work in Wales around this, and really got into some good conversations, really, with care workers, with managers, and with people that are involved with setting the standards and inspecting to those standards around, how can we humanise these a little bit, and think about what matters to the person, rather than assuming that these kinds of things that we think are important to people, these basic safety things, at the cost of actually living a life. We all take risks every day, don't we?
Yeah.
We kind of live with that to do the things that matter to us. So having there's no magic bullet, I don't think, but I do think it starts with just having some really difficult, probably, conversations about how we can disentangle some of these things and do things in a more human way. And I think, some of the findings were, for example, the use of humour, how you speak to residents. One care worker kind of said that she felt that she was judged for having particular unique relationships, because that could be seen within the standards as some kind of favouritism. But of course, again, you think of life, and we all naturally form stronger or
yeah, that's true,
richer relationships with people more than others. And when you're in a residential setting, and it's a home, isn't it? It's the home for the residents, and it's a very homely environment, or it should be. Those kind of relationships are they should naturally be different and unique depending on the different individuals within it. So, yeah, I kind of think that some of it relates to blind spots as well, that because of our inherited worldview, it's like the lens, isn't it, through which you see everything, and it feels so pervasive and normal that you forget that you're looking through this lens. And you have blind spots, and there's a brilliant, I think I can read you the quote from somebody called Kitwood, who wrote a lot about dementia care. And what he said, it links to the I-thou relationship. He said, the kind of care that we think is good care at the moment, you could be given the most accurate diagnosis, subjected to the most thorough assessment, provided with a highly detailed care plan, and given a place in the most pleasant surroundings without any meeting of the I-thou ever having taken place. And I think for me that kind of sums it up, that we can just miss this stuff. We really can, unless we actually make an intentioned effort to focus on it and reflect on it and talk about it. And I guess the other thing on that, and it's a different idea to having a rules-based, standardized approach to this sort of stuff, and it's called practical wisdom. And again, there's a really brilliant TED talk by Barry Schwartz, a psychologist, who talks about, how rules are encouraging us to do the wrong things, basically, in healthcare. And in a similar context, he talks about in a hospital how, if people followed the rules exactly, you wouldn't get these wonderful moments of care and humanity and compassion that he discovered in his research. So what he talks about, practical wisdom rather than rules. So rules are great for when you don't have to think, because you just follow them. You can go on autopilot. I worked in Malawi for 3 months, and I remember them saying that, they had the most under-resourced hospital ever, this maternity hospital. They were wanting to really train their midwives in this very standardized protocol so that they didn't have to think, because they had no time to think. And that kind of made sense in an emergency situation like that. Maybe it's like that for flying a plane, I don't know. But I guess if you want an I-thou encounter, rules are not going to give you that. You want people in the moment to be able to, I suppose it's sort of like common sense, isn't it? Practical wisdom, that you do the right things for the right reasons, and you can adapt and be responsive, and do what matters to the person. So it's much less of a rules driven thing and much more of a how do you help people use their practical wisdom for these situations, because every situation is different. People are not tins of beans, are they? So yeah, how you can be much more responsive to do what matters. And I guess linked to that is help people talk these things through. If it does seem like a complex or a grey area, ethical grey area, then wouldn't it be brilliant if care workers felt they could have open conversations about these things with others, rather than feel that they've got to hide it or feel guilty about it because they're not sure it fits with the rules. So for me, part of it is just encouraging a much more open an open culture around some of these things, so that people can talk things through if it is a grey area.
I really like that notion of practical wisdom.
It's great, isn't it?
I don't think common sense would work, just because it's
not quite the same.
No, and I think it's just got too much history with it.
Yes.
So like because there's the implication that if you don't use common sense, you're stupid.
That's true.
So I like the. I like that notion of practical wisdom. So what's and I think we've touched on maybe one or two of these areas already, but what surprised you most in your research and your findings? So I suppose some of the things that surprised me were this kind of thing about, there's no bad guys hiding behind the corner with their pens. And the guilt, I suppose, that some care workers felt for doing amazing things. But I guess maybe more broadly than that, I probably went into the PhD thinking that really what everybody needed, what society needs, is a shift in worldview. And I kind of feel like that's a bit naive now, a bit utopian, probably a little bit arrogant, actually, because I guess hidden within that belief is an assumption that my worldview was the right, was the best worldview or something, and everybody else is living with these outdated worldviews. But so I guess what really struck me was the fact that actually a shift in thinking isn't enough, and actually care workers were naturally wanting to work in these ways. It was the culture and the routines of the day, if you like, that were making that difficult. And I would hear things from managers that would say, care workers, they're very task-focused and maybe they need some training on person-centered care, so they're not so task-focused, as if going on might be a brilliant training course. I'm sure it would be, but
if you then go back to exactly the same culture that encourages you to be task focused and measures you on tasks and rewards you on how many tasks you get done, well, a shift in thinking, if a shift in thinking is part of it, is actually going to become quite frustrating for people, that they've had this shift in thinking, they want to work in these ways, and actually feel that it's very hard to do so within the prevailing culture. So that was a big shift, and with that, a huge compassion and appreciation and sense of awe, actually, for the amazing work that these care workers and everybody actually involved with the care homes that I spoke to were actually achieving, against all the odds in some ways, and in a line of work that doesn't attract as much reward financially, as much reward kind of in terms of I can't think of the word, reputation or whatever. Like, I just don't think we value care work enough and get a sense of these brilliant moments that care workers were having. So that certainly developed.
And you mentioned brilliant moments, Dan. I remember when we spoke like back last year, you talked about beautiful moments of connection. And I really love that. I mean, that's another turn of phrase that you've coined in the duration of this podcast that I've really liked. So, tell me more about that, about those beautiful moments of connection.
Yeah, sure. Well, I have to say, I wish I had coined it, but it wasn't my phrase.
Was it not? Okay.
No. It was a phrase that really resonated with me when I was interpreting the findings, and became a really useful way to conceptualize some of these things that were happening. Because what care workers, when I was speaking to care workers about what great care meant to them, what co-productive care meant to them, they didn't speak about a process or anything kind of standardized, even if it was an outcomes-focused, personalised process. That's really not what they spoke about. They spoke about very spontaneous, unplanned moments of connection. Whether that was brilliant conversations, or whether it was just these encounters that needed no words, but there was a real sense of genuine connection felt there. So it was a term coined by Owen and Mayer as part of their work on something called My Home Life, which is a social movement in residential care for older people, encouraging more relationship-focused ways of working. So I can give you some of that stuff in the references. So it was a huge inspiration to kind of come across that term, and just really helped conceptualize some of what came out of the findings as these moments of connection and unplanned, as I say, which was the interesting stuff. So the good stuff isn't the stuff that you can plan for quite often. it's like life, isn't it?
Yeah.
Life is what happens whilst you're making plans.
But that's it, isn't it? Because if you then, because I can imagine, right, that if, I don't know if it's fair to say, but I'll say it anyway, that a passionate and energised and determined care home manager, owner would be like, right, beautiful moments of connection, love that phrase, they're great, they're amazing, we want them to happen, so let's have more of those. And yet, in the way that you've described them, is actually you can't say I want more of those. They just happen. So is it? Yeah. So I can imagine, like, we then start to measure beautiful moments of connection, which then ruins the point of a beautiful moment of connection.
I know.
Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, we're very good at kind of killing something, aren't we, by trying to lock it down or prescribing it, or gosh, I end up being full of quotes and can never remember who says them. But there is a brilliant quote. I think this might be a Ken Wilber quote. Apologies if not. But what he says, I think, is that these moments, he's using a totally different context here, but these kind of moments are accidents. But what you can do is make yourself more accident prone.
Okay, all right.
And so for me, using that idea, it's about how you can, I think you can have an intention, you can foster a kind of intention to be open for these moments, and you can help people have the kind of headspace, again, being this kind of cognitive space where these moments are more likely. And we know what makes them less likely. It's all that kind of stuff about being rushed from task to task to task, etc., etc., and too much focus on paperwork, trying to lock everything down in paper rather than just actually having a moment with the person themselves. So there's all these kind of things that get in the way, and how could we actually help people have the kind of headspace that these moments are more likely to naturally and spontaneously arise. Is where my thinking goes on that one.
Yeah, and I think our discussion has taken me to places now where I'm thinking about, and it may be unfair of me to do so, but I think there's a lot of overlap between some of the principles that you're talking about, or some of the principles that you found in your research, and the workplace in general, really.
Yeah.
So if I think about the role of a manager, the role of a manager, whether it be in a care home or wherever, is quite bureaucratized, in terms of the processes you have to follow, the policies you have to adhere to, the guidelines you need to uphold, all of those sorts of things. And yet the things that matter the most, or the things that shape culture the most, at least in my experience in the research that I do, are those unplanned, spontaneous things. They're the moments where the manager puts down their pen and paper and she says, "Are you all right?"
Yeah.
And then a discussion happens off the back of that you weren't necessarily expecting. Or it's where a manager says, "You know what, go home. You've done enough this week. Just go." And it's not about having a HR person may want to then create a policy for what are the conditions that allow you to say to a member of your team you can go home, and how will you be consistent in your application of your go home instruction. But actually, it's not about that. It's about the and I guess I come back to the wisdom quote that you talked about earlier on. The practical wisdom. The practical wisdom is that if you can see somebody in your team is exhausted and they've worked incredibly hard that week, the practical wisdom is tell them to go home.
Yeah.
But it doesn't need a policy or a process or those sorts of things to go along with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, imagine if we had processes and standards to guide our lives. Just that it would be crazy, wouldn't it? And you can kind of see that for yourself, and then yet we think we need all these things in the workplace. So I think there's a lot of resonances there, and just how we help people almost unlearn some of the things that in the previous, in the mechanistic worldview are associated with being a good manager. How do we unlearn some of those and make it easier for people to bring their full selves, their human selves to the workplace, and, as you say, kind of bring that practical wisdom to do the right thing, really, for their colleagues. And
sticking there with that sort of train of thought for a moment, then, how have you taken sort of and when I say the findings, I don't mean like the findings that went into your thesis or the findings that have come out in the paper, but in terms of the things that you found, or the things that you've learned from your experience of doing that research, how has that affected your practice? How has that affected your approaches in work?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose, first of all, after the research, which was with care home staff, there was then a move to look at actually how can we encourage more relationship-centred care in home care as well? So care workers that work in people's own homes, and using some of the, as you say, some of the kind of insights, I guess, that came from the project was, first of all, let's start with the care workers rather than have something prescribed from the top, and just keep it really simple. Just by chatting to people about what matters to you in your day. How come you wanted to be in care, and what now is the most rewarding. And what care workers said time and time again was, it's all the wee things. It's just all the wee things. And they were often quite dismissive about it, like it was nothing. And yet these wee things were amazing. They were the things that made the hugest of differences to people. So we started there. But then used some of the examples of the wee things that might be, does that touch on something that's not prescribed in the standards? And therefore, what does that mean? Because it's self-evidently the right thing to do for that person, to actually have some conversations with then the managers who felt quite responsible for ensuring the quality of care and the upholding of these standards, to just get into some conversations about what kind of things do these examples throw up for you? You know, what tensions does that bring up? What dilemmas, and encouraging much more open conversations. I suppose that was the first really practical thing, but then opening it up much more broadly. I'm no longer linked to health and social care, but I'm in a part of the wider HR team now, okay. So much more of a corporate wide role for the council. And for the last year, it has been just over a year, really just kind of living, breathing, and actually dreaming quite often about this project, which has been about a performance framework that is all centered on relationships and the full person, you know, being a human at work, and that performance, do you know what, that's actually just a byproduct of all these different things. Been involved with lots and lots of development workshops for managers to actually explore over 2 days in a very small group, maximum 10 people, how, you know, why do relationships matter? You know, how do we focus on the full person at work? How do you reveal your full self? So you can be real in your conversations with others, and just exploring all the different kind of things that throws up for people over 2 days. And that's really been fascinating. And one of our what we call early adopters. So we picked 6 teams that really wanted to get behind this from the beginning, try things out, was in fact a care home for older people.
Oh, okay.
So it's almost kind of come full circle in some ways. So it's been really, really fascinating to hear from the team leader of that care home, who's been a total champion of this approach, really, to hear the difference that it's made just by putting an emphasis on conversations, on the full person. So, you know, asking care workers to work in person-centered relationship ways, brilliant, but they need to experience that themselves to be treated as a full person, not just what they do, but who they are actually. So just by changing the emphasis, and much more emphasis, for example, in their one-to-ones on, you know, how are you doing, as you say, you know, rather than let's get straight to the tasks and how many care plans are up to date and this, that and the other, just how are you? What's going on for you? How's your week been? What have you learned from that? What's been challenging? All these kind of things. So just that shift in emphasis, hearing what a difference that's made in their care home has been really interesting in light of those findings. So, yeah.
Oh, I might have to book you in for another podcast to talk about that some more.
It would be a pleasure.
Yeah, because I guess it's maybe. So you said it's been going a year, the project now.
Well, it's been almost a year since it was launched. It was launched April last year, but there's obviously the development and whatnot that led up to that. And the development itself was quite interesting, because that was what we tried to do, was not go away in a darkened room and invent something, but to genuinely kind of co-produce it with different teams to find out, well, you know, what would work for you, what's going to be flexible enough as a framework that's not going to get in the way of you having these brilliant conversations, because that's often as much of the challenge as anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it'd been in development, a year or so before that. But it's been launched almost a year.
Okay, so I want to kind of Bagsy, if that's a very Bristolian term that I know of. I want to reserve some of your time then later on in the year, so maybe like August time, maybe August, September time, something like that, where you're kind of over a year in to then explore, right, okay, have you found it, you know, how's it been, how have people found it, you know, what are you finding in terms of, because we've got some of the the short term impact that you were talking about, you know, you were alluding to earlier on, in terms of some of the things that have come from the experience of implementing it in the care home. But it'd be interesting to hear more about, you know, more and from a wider kind of perspective as well.
Yeah, totally. I'd be up for that.
Okay, that sounds good. All right. I guess I want to do a real tack change and ask it, and it's a bit of a selfish question, because at some point, you know, having completed my MSc a couple of years ago, I know that PhD, I would like that to happen at some point. So I'm going to be a little bit selfish, if I may, as a host, and say, how was doing a PhD and working?
So yeah, doing a PhD and working, it has its pros and cons, of course, as you can imagine. It at times was really hard. I mean, I'm not going to lie, I did have a moment, I think it was about halfway through, where I thought, gosh, you know, is this just too much? And it was at a stage when it was challenging to see how some of the stuff would all come together, because I'd picked such vast topics, if you like. Yeah. But yeah, I suppose for me, it was about finding the right way of working for me. So I would almost put it out of my mind. Not out of my mind, that's wrong, because it was always kind of sat there and I was noticing things. But in terms of giving myself stuff to actually work on, I wouldn't do that during the working week. I'd compress my hours, so I had every Friday off, and I would use the Friday, Saturday, Sunday to really then go into just immerse myself in it, and that really worked for me. What it did do, and this is it just gave me a different way of looking at the workplace. You know, I was looking at it through different eyes, which was fantastic. You know, that it really enhanced my working life by studying at the same time. It helped it feel really grounded, really relevant to my own life, as well as it being grounded in that kind of practical context. So for me, it was the way to do it. You know, it was yeah, brilliant, and it was a journey, and I miss it now. You know, as much as I don't miss, I am enjoying having weekends where I can just wake up and think, what shall I do today, rather than have all my, you know, my actions for the PhD planned out. That's brilliant. But on the other hand, I do miss the kind of the just that quest, that journey that you're on when you do a PhD, and just the different way of seeing things that brings.
Okay, thank you. That was my self-indulgent moment. Thank you. All right. So, is there anything else then that you think is important? So we said that this podcast is about emotion at work and humanising work, and we've talked about a whole host of things along that. You know, in terms of the change in society, but also change in work, and how that kind of links in with a desire for process and bureaucracy and certainty, and actually what matters the most to people appears to be the antithesis of that. So is there anything else that you're thinking, feeling, or want to say, or that you think is important for the listeners to hear?
I think I would just maybe leave it with something that was put to me by one of my key theoretical informants with all this, that certainly gave me food for thought, which is, we need to relate this stuff to our own lives rather than see it as something separate and out there. So what he asked me was to notice in my own life how I command and control, rather than be in the moment, be responsive. And it's quite fascinating when you look at that, because on the one hand, you can really believe in something and yet find it quite hard to do. And if you think about how you organise your days, how you plan your lives, it can just be quite revealing to think about how this mindset plays out in a very grounded everyday sense, and just to kind of notice these things. I guess I'll maybe just leave that as food for thought. Okay.
Can I not let you leave that as food for thought? Can I ask you for one example? So when you thought about it for your life, then would you be willing to share one example of how you thought, oh yeah, you know what, I do that in that way, and that stops me doing it?
Yeah, well, I guess, it's this thing of, for me, self-improvement. I love self-improvement. I'm always interested in, whether it's mindfulness, exploring that, or some kind of new hobby or new subject to explore. And that's great, except sometimes I notice that I can turn that into something very mechanistic. Must get up at this time every day and have a morning routine and start the day with 10 minutes meditating, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And actually, how useful is that, really, to do that? So just noticing the mindset that I bring to some of those things was quite fascinating, and doing that a lot. Yeah, I also recently went on a 7-day silent meditation, well, mostly silent meditation retreat, shall we say.
Oh, wow. How was that?
And I kind of thought, well, it was amazing, actually. It was one of the best things I've ever done, one of the hardest things as well. And it really showed to myself some of the things that we tell ourselves that are maybe not true. So, this thing of, well, if I had time, if I didn't have distractions, I'd be able to be in this kind of mode. Well, what I found was even with no distractions, other than literally just sitting and noticing things, my mind would still be very, very task focused quite often. It's really annoying. I was expecting to have all these amazing moments of enlightenment and, at one with whatever. And actually what it showed me was just how stuck my mind can get in some of these ways of being. So, yeah, that was quite interesting. And what I noticed was I would get these insights, but rather than just kind of sitting with them or being in the experience, I would be thinking, I can weave that into my next workshop about this kind of stuff, or I can share this as a story with people, So I was always one step ahead. And that got in the way of these things like being present and being open to things and being responsive and spontaneous. So, yes, that would be my example.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I've taken lots of notes as we've worked our way through, and so I'm going to, if I send them across to you, would you mind then adding kind of links to either books or papers, or the TED Talks and stuff I'll be able to find, but some of the authors that you mentioned, I wrote down like phonetically how I think their name might be spelt, but I don't know if that's accurate or not. So if I send you that over, would you mind just kind of pinging that back with some links so that if our listeners wanted to do more reading, more exploration, then they've got ways and means to be able to go and do that? Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Fab, thank you. So some standard guests then. Some standard guests. There you go. I'm mixing things together. Some standard questions that I ask our guests then. Is there anybody that you would recommend? Anybody you would suggest that that I need to go and seek out and get on the podcast?
In relation to this particular topic, or just because I think they're...
No, not necessarily specific. Just, I guess, somebody that you either think has got an interesting story to tell, or that you think you like to listen to, or you like to hear from.
Okay. Can I come back to you on that one with the links and the references?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, okay, lovely. Yeah, I'll give that a little bit of thought. Okay,
so we'll put links to. We'll send me that back, and then we'll also have links to books and TED Talks and all those sorts of things in the show notes for our listeners as well. Okay. So my final question then, is there anything else then that you're feeling want to say before I take us into the outro and wrap the podcast up?
No, I don't think there is.
Okay. In that case then, Sarah, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure.
I've really enjoyed it, and I'm excited already for the next instalment to hear more about how you've taken what you found in your PhD research and then applied it into a slightly different yet similar context and setting. And yeah, I've really, really enjoyed today, so thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, Sarah. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Emotion at Work podcast, written, recorded and presented by Phil Wilcox, edited together by Simon Leverton. You can find more information at emotionatwork.co.uk or follow us on Twitter at @PhilWilcox. Thanks for listening.